Earl, I unfortunately have to do this. I unfortunately have to grab this, Earl, and then we can be all ears for the task at hand, which is delving deep into the psychology of humanity. Earl, I unfortunately have to do this. Okay, let's go like that. Let's go mute that. I'm going to come over here. Okay, save. Done. Publish. All right, I think we're good to go here. Yes, sir, we are good to go. Welcome, everybody, to Season 2 of NDs for Truth. This is Episode 5. I'm Dr. Moshe Daniel Block. I'm here with David Nortman, and also Dr. David Nortman, who graduated from CCNM just a couple of years, I think, after myself. I was your clinician at one point. Is that right,
Yeah.
David?
So roughly 2 years, I think. I was 2004. So.
Yes, that's right. And you have a lovely bio and history, which I'll just get into a little bit. I'll invite other watchers, viewers, I think is the better word, to read the rest of it, and also to watch some of your videos. They're very well put together, excellent. Your background in philosophy and this philosophy of science and philosophy which you studied at the University of Toronto, I believe, and philosophy of science at Tel Aviv University. So it makes a very nice, well-rounded discussion with your focus on homeopathy and, of course, the philosophies of medicine and science. It's very interesting. So you graduated from a CCNM in 2004, and your modality of choice is classical homeopathy. 2 points for you. And with a quest for addressing physical obstacles to cure, which has led you down the path of using neurofeedback to treat traumatic brain injury and to screening patients for obstructive sleep apnea, a remarkably common yet under-recognized cause of chronic disease. So again, I will invite you to read some of the articles that Dr. Nortman has written in NDNR, which I have on the page below, and to watch some of his videos. So welcome, Doc. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Moshe, or Dr. Block, for
call me
inviting me over.
Fine. It's okay. My pleasure. It's my pleasure. It's my honor. I think that having these discussions, for my own healing, for my own enjoyment of talking to intelligent, well-informed people, naturopathic doctors in particular, have boiling down, discussing philosophically, musing over what has just happened and what it continues to happen in our profession, in medicine at large, in humanity. So these are important discussions. So whether it's for our own edification right now or for posterity, it just feels like a very nice thing to be able to do. So our topic of discussion today is, why do reasonable people believe in unreasonable things? And to get things going, I'd like to just ask you, when the pandemic started, so there's the pandemic, there's the talk of, this novel virus, but then there's also the whole response to it. What was your response to to COVID in its dawnings? I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah. So I think the earliest I remember of it was hearing about the virus, and that was just something that invited curiosity. I'm personally not that afraid of infectious disease. But then when I heard the term social distancing, that was the first moment that made me cringe. And I thought, no way. I mean, no way this is actually going to gain traction.
Right. And tell me a little bit more. I have my own personal feeling, but I'm curious about what about social distancing made you cringe, if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, it seemed like it's a fundamental assault on humanity, something like that. That even before starting to think about whether it is a legitimate way of dealing with the pathogen. Right. So initially, I would say I gave the authorities the benefit of the doubt. They said, fine, let's see let's see those 2 weeks, if what's going to happen after 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And for the sake of my grandparents, I was careful, certainly, but in a pragmatic way, right? I wasn't afraid. But after those 2 weeks, I said,
Right.
that's it. Something else is going on here. And that's when I started to think along naturopathic lines. Essentially, we are experts in dealing with such things in a non-specific way, right? Our expertise is non-specific treatment. Certainly, I know, just knowing how poorly flu vaccines work, and how well giving vitamin D and zinc works, and how that can eliminate the tendency to have recurrent flus. To me, it just seemed, completely commonsensical. That's the approach.
Yes.
And once I heard about cytokine storms, for example, the idea of a hyperreaction of the immune system as being a causative factor in the mortality, that turned me toward vitamin D.
Yes.
And once I heard about the loss of smell, that turned me towards zinc, even though it probably turned out to be a different mechanism unrelated to zinc. But basically, regardless, it was obvious that the basics, vitamin D, zinc, antioxidants such as C, would be the way to go, and that that they're all cheap, widely available, completely safe. And I started telling people that much, take those things. And just more generally, I guess my thought as a naturopath was that we as naturopaths need to speak out, not so much in general or vague terms about how general health matters, because we can't immediately transform people's health overnight and on a wide scale. So I guess what was missing for me in the naturopathic response, insofar as there was any, and obviously there was no centralized response other than suppression, the gag order, at least in certain jurisdictions.
Especially in Ontario.
Yeah, and that's where I am. I am in Toronto.
I know.
So, and I didn't know at the time that the regular doctors received the same gag orders, right? So it wasn't at all. It was a much bigger story. At the time, I remember listening to your early talks, and we somehow felt victimized. We thought that we were selected to be gagged.
Right, but then it became evident that this, whatever hand was, moving through the different governing bodies, had done so quite extensively across the board through all professions, and of course moving into academia and everything like that as well.
Yeah.
So you said something interesting, that there was an assault on humanity, or you thought. So did you have a framework before, because some people came into awakening of the, things are not what they appear to be in terms of the media and the government and the health experts. And it took COVID to wake them up. But did you have a sort of a framework before this for some possible, collusion of some sort?
Oh, yes. I mean, I guess that's my background as a homeopath. I mean, I studied some of the scientific literature and compiled it some years ago. And so I could see how the media treated studies that were designed to fail and publicized them, right? There was, for example, 2005, there was the Sheng et al. Study that was a dismal study, but then it was accompanied with the end of homeopathy ? Editorial, right, in the Lancet, I believe.
Yeah.
And how that got, amplified ad nauseum for years.
Yes.
There was also my attempt to edit the Wikipedia page of homeopathy, also around then. And that was a personal lesson in censorship, because I could tell how within 30 seconds to 5 minutes of a change that was favorable to homeopathy, it was reverted by someone or other. And I'm not sure if it was a bot program to pick it up in something systemic, something deliberate, or whether it was just a sufficient number of people sufficiently propagandized to believe that they needed to defend science against
homeopathy, or,
Yeah.
or somebody who's vehemently against homeopathy, who sits there waiting for the opportunity to correct that page, or
But yeah,
any of the above.
it was suspiciously quick, and I tried different times of day and so forth. It was
Yeah.
always a very, very quick reaction. And once I wrote something a bit less favorable about homeopathy. I wrote something about that. I added remedies, strange remedies like Berlin Wall and so forth. And somehow that stayed there forever.
Because it could be used as a point of mockery or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a point of dismissal. Well, that's
So that was a personal experience. I actually corresponded with James Randi also a good 20 years ago, and I got a sense of somebody who is pretending to be an impartial arbiter. And when I presented him with a whole bunch of data, he kind of said, "Well, I don't know. I'm just a small person, regular person. I can't quite tell. I'm not
strange.
capable of judging this." Suddenly he went offline on me. So,
but do you know the Joe Schwartz of Montreal? Do you know who that guy? Joe
Yes.
Schwartz is? He's a chemist. He
through Ananda Moore's film Magic Pills.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Exactly. He's in that with the quackery, and he's got a whole bunch of ducks lined up all in his office.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's been a staunch opponent to homeopathy, and he's been asking for years and years, where's the evidence? Show me the papers, show me the scientific research. And Andre Sain had a wonderful debate with him at McGill University. There were hundreds of people that showed up, and he presented paper after paper from very legitimate scientific organizations, and sometimes they were national organizations, literally like the Swiss government, did this study, and it showed homeopathy to be very significant. And what does Joe Schwartz say after 20 years of asking for the research? Let's not compare papers with papers. That's what he said. So he dismissed everything with a wave of his hand after having requested it, which shows that he's not really a scientist. He's not interested in the facts. He has an agenda. There's an agenda there.
Mm-hmm.
So you've encountered that agenda as well, and you were aware of, at least to a certain degree, censorship in science and in medicine.
Yeah, for sure.
Did it go any beyond that for you? Was there any kind of, what one might even consider, or what others might call a conspiracy of any sort?
I mean, not. I like to explain things in the simplest possible way. So I would say that I'm at the low end of the conspiracy spectrum.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So but obviously those conspiracies of almost all of them turned out to have a large kernel of truth. So
I agree. The idea that they're theoretical, in other words, they're just a theory. We know, I've discussed this on the show before, on ND for Truth before, that the very term conspiracy theory was created to label people who question what happened to JFK.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it started.
Yeah.
So it's basically when you just label somebody like an anti-vaxxer, as soon as you label somebody, then it's easy to just hashtag them out of existence or cancel them or diminish them in some way.
Yeah. And the thing is, I also, read a little bit of the history of medicine inspired by the homeopathic perspective. So for me, I could see that medicine was built on a foundation of medical fundamentalism, essentially, right? That starting with the Flexner Report, 1910, kind of clearing away the naturopathic, the homeopathic influences, focusing on only a single approach, which, however powerful, is not sufficient.
Right.
I could really see how medicine was fundamentally fundamentalist as opposed to pluralist. Right, that was already obviously clear to me, and naturopathic medicine is premised on the idea of pluralism,
and
which is why.
Sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
Yeah, which is why I found it curious to hear of naturopaths who were basically following the narrative. It made no sense whatsoever, and I guess the question of why do reasonable people believe in unreasonable things especially applies to naturopaths, because they should know better. It should have
I felt so too. I've been pretty disappointed by how infiltrated by all the agendas, and the psychological manipulation, so what's called social engineering these days, was so deeply rooted as well in our profession.
Mhm.
I was very disappointed to see that.
And I mean, naturopath, that just goes to say that naturopaths are still human beings subject to the same psychological framework, and that our belief systems are varied, meaning my belief system in which I fit naturopathic medicine and yours and other people's are all different. There's actually a different and sometimes quite personal framework, right? How we frame reality.
Absolutely.
And where in that framework how our relationship to naturopathic medicine fits in to that reality.
Sure.
And evidently other naturopaths have a completely different paradigm in which they operate, like that psychological paradigm.
I agree, which we'll get into more, I imagine, tonight. So you mentioned this like fundamentalist approach to medicine. Mm-hmm. What I think people don't pull the veil back enough to look at is like, who started this fundamental approach and how did it become the fundamental regard of what medicine is? When it'd be like the story of 5 people standing around in a schoolyard, and one of them is a bully, and threatens to beat up the other 4, and then establishes his way, or perhaps her way, but probably more likely his way, his way to dominate the others, and then in time that just gets forgotten, the origin of that. But if you look at it, like, what gave right to this ragtag bunch? The American Medical Association wasn't any impressive organization if you look at 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of it, and I don't know the history that well, but that throughout history you see kind of warring factions, and there is the more rationalistic side, which tends to be the establishment, perhaps in past tends to be more associated with men, and then the more empiricist approach, which perhaps in the past was associated more with women who were the herbalists, often not as much as perhaps the men, perhaps even more so in certain societies, the so-called witches. And that there is a current of suppression of that right brain, feminine, etc. archetype. Certainly in the Western religions, we see that a lot. Less and so in the Eastern religions. Which is why in the Eastern cultures, there's less of that fundamentalism in medicine, right? You've got TCM alongside conventional medicine in China. You've got a whole range of medicines in India, and a much more welcoming and pluralistic approach.
Yes, but not to say that the age-old archetypal domination by the masculine is not occurring in those cultures. It just perhaps to a different degree or to a lesser degree.
Yeah, or at least to a lesser degree in this domain. Yeah, so I think it's something that's been happening all the time, and there's a kind of a pendulum swing now. In recent decades, people have swung away from conventional medicine, then they're coming hard to suppress us. Now they're again suppressing us. That's what's happening, right? It's a system that is in crisis and falling apart, and at a certain moment, such systems turn tyrannical by nature.
Yes. And I do find it ironic and this is again a failing in naturopathic medicine. Not everyone, but definitely at the level of the colleges and a lot of the newer grads, is this desire to gain credibility by emulating this tyrannical fundamentalist approach, bully of conventional medicine, who's self-established authority in medicine. So while it's falling apart and looking for solutions, and many doctors are finding a more naturopathic kind of functional medical approach. So I wrote an article in the Indian Hour when I use this analogy that we're going to be passing each other. Naturopathic medicine is trying to become like conventional medicine, while conventional medicine is becoming like naturopathic medicine. I said, will we wave at each other as we pass each other by?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so optimistic about conventional medicine going that way. I think it's pretending to, because it has to gain lost credibility. But I mean, I think fundamentally the concern is that that conventional medicine is crashing. It's really crashing, and it's not going to be a pretty picture because and what we've had so far is possibly just the beginning of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, anybody who's reviewing what's going on rather than just this sort of accepting everything at face value and forgetting what was said by the different, leadership organizations in medicine and just, which is constantly changing. They're changing the definition of things. But anybody who's watching can see the horrible failure of the conventional approach in this pandemic, in COVID crisis.
Right. But unless, as I said, they have a different worldview that prevents them from seeing the truth in the same way that that James Randi or Joe Schwartz have their agendas. And I guess my point is that ultimately the agenda is psychological if we trace it back far enough. It's not Joe Schwartz happens to have a job doing what he's doing, but he was obviously selected because he fit the job.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, okay. So this is a good time to segue into like another question I want to ask you. What do you think are the overarching influences that led to the pandemic response?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, so I think fundamentally is that what I said, the fact that medicine has a fundamentalist orientation, meaning that it was ready to pounce on an opportunity and exert its tyrannical power essentially through its its various ramifications in government and
Yes.
The health agencies and so forth. I guess the background to that, besides what I mentioned, the century of fundamentalist medicine, there is also perhaps 70 years or so of militarized approach, mainly by the US, but generally the West, in the context of the Cold War, right? That there were developed various secretive military operations that purported to protect us from an external enemy. And later on, that transformed into the anti-terrorist security state.
Yes.
Right? And then after 9/11, we had this gradual rise of a concern with bioterrorism. Right? Anthrax, it began as anthrax, but it transformed into just dealing with any pandemic, right? And pandemic response exercises by the dozens that have been performed over the past 20 years, involving, the usual public and private partnerships, right?
Right.
And then you couple that general militarized approach, and the issue with the militarized approach is that it's fundamentally unaccountable and secretive. They don't see themselves as needing to be accountable to the citizen through the usual democratic process. So they're above the law to begin with.
And that's part of the whole national security. That's
right.
That's what they put forward.
And it's a mindset. It's a mindset that they think is perhaps fundamentally benevolent, but ultimately through industry influence becomes self-serving and I think demented. Ultimately, it's a demented mindset when it's just carried over to other domains.
Well, this is very common for any kind of totalitarian move. The regime will start to use terms like it's for your protection.
Right.
And the Nazis did it. In Russia, it was done. And it's not uncommon. It's part of the dictator's handbook.
Yeah, but I don't think the intention, at least in those Western countries, was totalitarian. I think it was supposedly to oppose totalitarianism. But there is, but it gradually transformed into totalitarianism. I think because, as I said, of the influence. Once medicine, once they started to approach medicine in that way, so they basically introduced the medicine's fundamentalism into the picture, the mindset. And then, of course, you have the pharmaceutical industry, right? Which starting after the war, Second World War, chemical companies looking for work, etc. And basically they consolidated their power. And it is absolutely it's mind-boggling. Even for me, it's been mind-boggling to see the extent of their tentacles.
Right.
how they've influenced. We can talk for hours about ivermectin and the design to fail trials and design to succeed trials and vaccines and so forth, right? I think we can leave that aside as far as the details, but the idea is that the infiltration is total. I mean, that's why I would say that it's not just corruption, it's really rot. The system is rotten to the foundation, which is why it has to collapse. It's not just going to
that I would agree. And that the influence that we're talking about, we can name it big pharma, but that's just one of the wings of influence is through medicine and through big pharma. The influence goes much broader, and the extent of that infiltration is truly mind-boggling, and it can be a little bit very overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I, of course, have very deep spiritual beliefs, which we could talk about later. So I'm not concerned. I'm not afraid. And I have reasons for not being afraid. But to encounter this, I've always been open to these different power plays to a certain extent, but never have I really come full faced confronting the extent that, like the way you put it was really good.
Yeah, but I guess the point is that all of this has been brewing for a century, for decades, right? The different influences finally coalescing in one moment, and that's why it's overwhelming, because even though we've been aware of those influences individually, I think it's been incredible to watch them coalesce into a tsunami all at once. Right.
Yes. Now, I just want. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Just this infiltration in every respect, right? How the health agencies are completely non-scientific and anti-scientific. How governments are beholden to those influences. How the media was colluding, as if like a coordinated symphony, right? Like a symphony conducted by one conductor. Again, it's not a conspiracy theory because it's been built up over time. It wasn't happening in real time. The conducting, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It was created gradually where every person knew their part.
It's quite impressive. I say this sometimes, like, have you ever tried to get together like a handful of people to coordinate something? It could even be a party, or let's go for a hike in the woods. It's hard to coordinate people, and the extent of coordination is quite impressive. I do want to ask for one point of clarity, because I didn't understand what you said. I mentioned like Nazis and like the communist regime of like Lenin and Stalin. You said the purpose was not, I forget what you said, but you said the purpose was to oppose totalitarianism.
No, I said that with respect to the Western military complex in the context of the Civil War, opposing not during the war, but meaning in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That's
I understand. That's what you're referring to. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. As you were, soldier. Proceed as planned. What were we talking about? So we're talking about the extent of the influence.
And add to that, I think another important factor, and that's where it's possible to get into conspiracy thinking, but that's only because the picture is more murky, is ultimately the influence of the globalist influence, right? Which goes back in some form or other centuries through bankers in the Middle Ages, through various royal families, and the fact that even though the British Empire has officially fallen apart, still London is the financial center of the world, and has a lot of covert influence. And you see the Rockefellers, right, playing a role in medicine throughout the last 122 years, right, literally. You see that their name coming up again and again and again, and then there are people talking about the need to control population, which is itself a reasonable perspective. So I think a lot of those globalists do intend good in their own mind.
These globalists can also be kind of synonymous with technocrats, the technocrat globalists, right? Like including, you mentioned, the population control, proponent is Bill Gates, who's been a not so conspicuous player in this whole pandemic.
Yeah, and I don't know if he's evil or not. It concerns me less because I believe that people should be judged by their actions, by the results of their actions. And what we can see in practice is that pretty much everywhere his foundation, everything the foundation touches turns into the opposite of gold, right? It turns into fraud. And you see the Cochrane collaboration getting money from him. And then suddenly now they're publishing fraudulent meta-analysis of ivermectin, even though they used to be reliable. They used to be the only ones who could be more or less relied on.
Yes.
And his influence on ivermectin, of course, his influence on the vaccine as the only solution. I mean, that was, I guess, one of the most horrifying moments for me, is hearing him say that, we need to not have anybody get infected until we come up with the vaccines. Right?
And therefore, we have to maintain this lockdown.
Yeah, and I knew that his influence was great enough that would happen. And to people who say that, oh, well, how, he's just doing his thing, he's allowed to do his thing, you do your thing.
He's
trying to contribute. Again, I say judge a person by the result of his actions, and the results have obviously been disastrous.
Yeah, like in India with the polio vaccine and hundreds of thousands of children becoming paralyzed and stuff like that. And the Indians threw him out. Yeah. But the new president has kind of enabled him to finagle his way back in. So, yes.
Money speaks. And, and he's not the only one. I mean, I think ultimately he is a symptom of something else, right? That of our admiration for power and money, and I guess for a lack of vision, perhaps also because there is a vacuum, arguably, of vision that those people fill in. But they also create a culture in which there is a lack of vision through their influence in terms of breaking down the foundations of our society.
Definitely. Yeah. I was one of the moments, there were many moments where I just saw it degrading further and further away into irrational, unscientific, just denying all the things that we take it for granted in science and medicine. When Justin Trudeau met with Bill Gates to determine how Canada would respond to this situation. I mean, if that's not obvious enough to you, I don't know. Like, first of all, when has a non-medical entity ever been consulted for such a large decision?
Yeah. I mean, it was obvious. Yeah, they are both dunces, and they don't deserve to be where they are. But again, I guess ultimately I think we as a civilization, we get the leaders that we ask for somehow. That perhaps ultimately it's less about blaming them and looking inside each of us for why the power structures are as they are, while recognizing that we have to make people aware that it's not at all a conspiracy, that power is heavily centralized in a dangerous way.
Yes.
And that can lead to disaster going forward, such as with the climate crisis response, right? There is a climate crisis, really a broader ecological crisis, but the ecological crisis response might be much worse if we get it wrong. And we will get it wrong if we listen to those people.
And it's that's another one of the tentacles of the octopus that is attempting to gather centralized power as the environment and climate change and everything. Just another reason that humanity needs to be governed and can't make its mind up on its own. It needs to have technocratic superiors determining its future. That's the whole dark, dismal, overshadowing of all of this.
Yeah.
So, did you want to say something that, because we can move on to the next topic, but I'd like to hear from you first.
Yeah, and I guess another thing that is important in terms of what I saw is just the more spiritual perspective, that from a spiritual perspective, we often see when evil rears its head, or the dark side, if you wish to call it, whatever you wish to call it. Evil usually is good people doing bad things rather than overtly bad people. And when it rears its head, there is usually an inversion of fundamental or traditional morality. So the Nazis, for example, took a page from Nietzsche. They kind of bastardized some of Nietzsche's later ideas, and they flipped Christian morality on its head, right? Instead of talking about the need to support the weak and our sinfulness, etc., they flipped it around. They said that the Übermensch, the power will triumph over weakness, and that's the fundamental morality to follow. And they also took the swastika symbol, which was a symbol of auspiciousness in various cultures, and they literally, they turned it 45 degrees, and they basically completely inverted its meaning. Right now, it was the symbol of their inverted morality.
Yes.
So I think that's a telltale sign, spiritually speaking, when things are inverted. And what happened with the pandemic, and it's pretty obvious, but I think it's worth mentioning, is the inversion that civilization is built on sacrifice of the present for a better future, right? Any human civilization does that, and instead we flip it around. We sacrifice the future for a supposedly better present. Mm-hmm. Even that failed, but let's say if that were to succeed momentarily, still, it would be basically a civilizational failure and evidence for the operation of the dark side. And similarly with children, right? Any civilization protects its children, right? The civilization that kills children, such as the Spartans, doesn't last.
Yes.
The civilization that sacrifices its children doesn't last.
Of course not. It's absurd. It's absurd. It's like the future, preparing for the future now.
Yeah.
And also there was also another inversion of the whole idea, like when you're on a plane, you put your oxygen and mask on first, and then you can help others. And the idea that first, Jordan Peterson is big in this too. First you clean up your own room, then you could take care of the world. Yeah. And not with this. This was inverted to say that, we're all in this together and you have to sacrifice your own sense of well-being for the good of everybody. So that was also a distortion. Yeah, exactly. And that demonic phrase, together apart or apart together, I don't remember which way, but it was said, but somehow being together apart. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It's like they had an Orwellian, newspeak office to create these lines. It's like straight out of the playbook of Orwell's 1984, and the inversion of logic, we also see that in what's happening as well in other social circles, like with cancel culture and woke culture. Mm-hmm. Also inversion of these things where you hear statements like, the very extreme statements like hatred as a response to hatred is not hatred, it's love. Yeah, or racism as a response to racism, right? In the context of deliberate anti-white racism or what. Right. It's not racism because it's a response to racism. Therefore, it's not racism. It's justice. It's like these kinds of things, which is very like kind of retaliatory and vengeful. There's a kind of vengeance to it. And there's ultimately what I think is best viewed as like not something that's contrary to the image of God, the way that things should be in the spiritual sense, right? Which is, just to tie it briefly to homeopathy, is I studied with a homeopath by the name of Vega Rosenberg, who brought in a lot of Kabbalistic ideas into how to view reality. And his way of teaching what's to be cured in homeopathy was like, in what way is that person not in the image of God? Right. So in that sense, we can also look at reality. Like, in what way is this culture not in the image of God? And obviously, every culture is, has its quirks. But when you see a complete inversion, right, where you see something that's literally the image of God is flipped on its head, then that's ultimately demonic, satanic, right? That's, spiritually speaking, it should be very clear to anybody who is attuned to the image of God. There's no question about it. It's not about the statistics and whether the vaccine works a little bit or a lot or doesn't work, and whether
lockdowns maybe work or don't work, etc. All of that is irrelevant to the overall picture.
I appreciate you, Dr. Nortman. You have a very very well-grounded, scientific, intelligent, good vocabulary, and you just kind of very casually come out with these big statements, these almost like dropping bombs. I appreciate it deeply, even in your discussion of science. The homeopathy and the consilience with the other scientific approaches and everything. You're speaking casually to these scientific minded people, and you just bring in aspects of the angelic realm and like consciousness. And I love that. I appreciate that. That's how I think I'd love to see naturopathic doctors always speaking openly in that way.
Yeah, and they're two sides of the same coin. I mean, that's the important thing to know, to understand. Unless you really are conversant with both sides, then you're probably missing something. If you're scientific and also stringently atheistic.
Yes.
And I can't say that I'm, let's say, a believer in God's, but there is a sense that I don't know the whole truth, right? So there's the openness to the spiritual realm. And also it's a great tool, even in what's called a non-realist approach. That's a term from philosophy of science. I mean, you don't have to believe in the model or the theory to make use of it. So at the very least, from a non-realist perspective, we can talk about the spiritual realm quite freely and confidently.
Oh, I love that. I think it's a tremendous asset, and also it's a really nice approach. You might not realize this, or maybe you do because you're very philosophical, but when you speak of something and you acknowledge the demonic, you are just by default also acknowledging the angelic, the divine, and the presence of God, essentially. And my approach, like, I got that chilling kind of feeling like when the pandemic started, like the convergence of all these different arms of that which would control what have you. We could go into that. We've already gone into it to a certain degree. So that which wants to control, that's what I saw unfolding right away. It's almost like I'd been waiting for it in the back of my mind. And then when they sprung the first steps, I said, here we go. This is what this is about. So that
it's the Faustian perspective, the Faustian bargain of like knowledge and power for the sake of selling your soul to the devil. Essentially, that's the kind of the archetype of it. And for sure, that's a hugely influential archetype, I guess, in contemporary society as we seek to control things more and more. And I guess that perhaps is my final thought about the factors. Bringing the pandemic, it's ultimately the fact that we as a society, modern society, late modern society, let's call it, we've gotten used to controlling things and having things safe and secure. We know that most likely we will live to a relatively ripe old age more than in the past, and so forth. And certainly medicine, although of course hygiene more than medicine, and the whole everything about modern existence, like thermostats and so forth, and central heating and refrigerators are responsible for that. But because of that, we expect more and more. We've come to expect that security, and we want our governments to deliver that. Right, 100 years ago in the Spanish flu, nobody expected the government to save us from that. And now, I mean, insofar as we were told that there was something to be saved from, which is questionable, we really accepted government intervention, right? Even in Australia, which was just horrifying to watch, the majority supported and still, in retrospect, support what they did there. I think something like 70 or 80%.
I wonder about that. I actually wonder about those statistics and how honest and how accurate they are. But if we do take them at face value, certainly I was surprised to see, in Quebec, for instance, Legault, the Premier Legault, at first he was very against the narrative on multiple levels.
That's the Quebec Premier, right?
Yeah, Quebec Premier, yeah. he was against it, and he did a very stark 180, and then people were, and his reasoning was, this is what the Quebec people want. They want safety. They want, because the infection of fear had already been implanted. So
Yeah.
But I don't believe it, though. Like, for instance, in the United States, I don't believe that people in the United States at large, more than a majority, want the government to determine.
No, the United States is a special case, and I've been proud of Americans, I would say, especially Republicans, but not only. I mean, I'm not particularly
mostly conservatives. Like the whole, like, having government more involved is definitely more of a leftist, aggressive kind of thing. More government overreach, or that's a negative concept, but more government involvement, let's say, right? Yeah.
But I think that's still, I belong to the camp of, as I've already mentioned, I think that we get the government that we want. So, now in Ukraine, most Russians support Putin, and it's not just because of the propaganda. It's because he provides them with a sense of meaning in terms of their Russian nationalism and so forth. So ultimately, like I just spoke about a Faustian bargain, I think there's also what's called a Hobbesian bargain. So there's Thomas Hobbes, the English political theorist, and he spoke about, like, his vision of a government was a benevolent dictator that we would readily submit to collectively in order to escape the so-called state of nature, which was nasty, brutish, and short. That's a famous quote from him. And so basically we would submit our freedom in response to safety. Right, that idea has always permeated human societies beyond the tribal ones. And that's probably why empires arose in the first place. That's my guess, and I think ultimately that Hobbesian bargain has its psychological roots, and that's what if you'd like, we can move on to that and discuss, like, what ultimately I think is my biggest question is, like, why do people, who are reasonable, to whom you present reasonable evidence, and they are reasonable in other aspects of their lives, somehow they just buy, they've bought into this, and in many cases continue to buy into this despite the collapse of the narrative.
Yes. I think it's going to be difficult to get a real true sense of statistics, because my impression, like, for instance, I did come to the US, and I am also proud of the number of Americans that are not buying into the narrative. Whether or not they're perfect people is beside the point, and we accept them for their humanness and all the beauty that we are in our humanness. But in so far as not accepting the narrative, I salute them greatly. And so where I am, it's considered a pretty, red state or conservative state. Just about everybody that I meet is aware of what's going on, as you and I are, as aware.
Yeah.
So, and I know that this is not the only state. There's many, many, many states, and I also assume that there are Democrats are also aware. Like, it's not like you're a Democrat, therefore you're completely blinded by the agenda. No. But certainly that is the side to which, on which the narrative has been more closely absorbed and accepted in a mainstream narrative.
Yeah. Right? And I would say, unfortunately, the situation in Toronto is not the situation in the Midwest, right? Here, especially downtown, we lived downtown and we ended up escaping there for various logistical reasons, such as needing our child to be not masked.
Right.
But also we saw how people there were really completely sucked into it. A bit less in the suburbs, but I would say overall, still there's, the basic psychological need to believe in authority, to desire safety in the sense that the authority buffers you from the dangers of life, right? That's the Hobbesian idea, right? That brutish, nasty, and short state of nature, as opposed to this social contract that you enter into to live in a civilized way where you give up something,
Right.
fundamentally. And there's conformism, generally speaking. But again, this doesn't, I think, explain why many people conformed to the main narrative as opposed to conforming to the alternate narrative, which had a bunch of adherents as well. So there's something deeper that I wanted to explore. And again, we can look at this idea of the question of like naturopaths, right? How come naturopaths who supposedly are conforming, so to speak, to the naturopathic perspective, the alternative perspective on reality, how come even they, in significant numbers, and how come certain friends of mine that luckily nobody disowned me for any reason, but still, they quietly oppose my view. They quietly persist in their worldview despite evidence that I've presented to them and which they've actually to some extent attended to.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess that's a good segue to what is my suggested answer to this question. And that's based on a book written by a cultural anthropologist by the name of Ernst Becker. And he lived in 1924 to 74 and wrote this book, The Denial of Death. I can show it, I guess.
Which he himself couldn't deny, dying at only 50 years old.
I know. Quite ironic. He died shortly after. So he wrote this in 1973. It made some waves and even won a Pulitzer Prize for what it's worth, but then was promptly forgotten because it wasn't, it wasn't all good news and, fun stuff, right? It was really a deep look into the human condition, and other than like literature or religious texts, I've never come across anything that really nails it, really delves as deeply into the human condition and as accurately.
But if you look at what has become, let's say, very mainstream, if you look at historically, Freud. So, I mean, his theories, as I read in the paper that you wrote, which was titled, it's a really good paper, the Denial of Death as the Origin of Culture and Religion. You're referring to Becker and all these topics. Freud became hugely popular and became mainstream, but his theories are fundamentally inaccurate. And this Becker, I mean, it makes a lot of sense how influential the ultimate denial of death as a result of fear is, but that didn't become very mainstream because, again, the overlords, put it, have a great influence over what gets mainstream, what gets touted across the world and studied in our schools. It's the stuff that doesn't bring you too close to truth.
Right. Yeah. And that's a huge topic. Yeah, to discuss that. And I'm not probably the right person to discuss that because I think it requires a lot of knowledge of exactly the machinations of those overlords.
Yeah.
But that's certainly one aspect, right? That there is a lot of influence through who gets the money to make Hollywood films and which Hollywood films get made and which books get published by the big publishers, etc. And, again, without needing to get into conspiracy, there is definitely that influence. But I mean, I'd like to even set that aside to say, okay, even if that's the case, or if that weren't the case, let's say if that influence didn't exist, would we be immunized against believing in false narratives, or would there still be a reason for us to believe in false narratives? And Becker's suggestion is that there are fundamental psychological / existentialist reasons for that we have to create narratives, and that it's very easy to get the narrative wrong for psychological reasons and persist in the belief in it. So,
well, one might even say, if I may interject, that as soon as you create the narrative, it's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong as soon as it's created, because it's created to, alleviate the fear of death rather than embracing the reality of it.
Yeah. So and I guess that's the Eastern perspective. Ultimately, why we can, the Eastern perspective says that all of reality is illusion, right? Not in the sense that materiality doesn't exist, but in the sense that as soon as we view things a certain way, then we are no longer experiencing reality as it is.
Right.
Yeah. So, Becker's theory is ultimately, it's a more of a Western theory, right? It's not so much an Eastern theory, and what he's doing is the fundamental existential problem that he's presenting is that in the raw form, the world is harsh and terrifying, and it's terrifying not only in the physical sense that we need to survive, right? That life is nasty, brutish, and short, but in the sense that we also need to feel safe, not just to be safe, but to feel safe. And feeling safe means that we don't want to not just die in a physical sense, but we also want to stay alive and be immortal in a symbolic sense. Like, we realize that we're going to die, that we're finite creatures in time and in place and in influence, and that ultimately we're afraid of being cosmically insignificant, or we're afraid of being being under eternal damnation. Those kinds of fears are ultimately what drive us, even more so than the biological fear of death, right? So the fear of death that he's referring to, which needs to be denied, and the denial is that Freudian concept, is the symbolic fear of death, the fear of death of us as souls as opposed to as bodies. And that, I guess, Freud, he was ultimately wrong on a lot of things, and we'll talk more about Freud, but he did have some fundamental insights that were quite brilliant, and I think those
I agree.
Basic mechanisms of the soul, the fact that there are warring factions in the soul that don't necessarily see eye to eye, etc. This basic idea of subconscious and
that's significant.
So the idea of denial as pushing something that we can't handle, that creates unlimited anxiety to the subconscious, I think, is a brilliant insight, along with ideas such as projection. Right?
Yes.
The oral phase and the anal phase are marvelous observations that we really see those in real life all the time.
Sure. Since this is NDs for Truth and we're talking together, I just wanted to address two things that you've spoken in a way which is to be taken for granted.
Okay.
But I want to offer an alternative, at least a possible alternative to these ideas. First of all, the world as a harsh place. So I think that it is true, but a lot of that does come down to corruption. There will always be harshness. There will be an earthquake that we can't do anything about. But if we really provided for each other, if there wasn't this fundamental corruption and greed, then I think there's plenty of resources and humanity could be pretty well off and not being eaten alive by tigers and stuff like that,
Yeah, but the idea, though, is that ultimately we all die and we can't have endless influence. So I think you speak from a place of a higher perception. I mean, you've found, I guess Becker would say that you have found a way of perceiving reality, and your narrative makes you experience the harshness of life as not harsh. You see,
yes.
Like he would not agree with you that life is not harsh. In other words, we are ultimately biological creatures subject to decay,
right.
And yet we see infinity, and we can envision anything. We can travel in time and in space and create things in our mind in an infinite way, and yet we can't stay there. We can't hold on to that.
Right.
And that's the challenge.
That's the second point that I wanted, just to provide an alternative way, because whenever I encounter something of the nature of a belief, I can understand why you would believe that. It's very almost completely fundamental to humanity. But there are those who have walked the path that have challenged that. And in particular, the yogic tradition and in Taoism. So you have immortal masters in both of these traditions. So there's the immortal golden body called Hsien. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's just Hsien, Hsien. In China, in amongst the Taoists, and in yoga, there are the immortal Siddha yogis. So,
are you speaking about literally immortal people? I'm confused.
I'm talking about literally immortal. Okay, so we have to define immortal. Do they live forever and ever, as in millions and millions of years? No, I don't think so. But could they live bodily for hundreds of years and up to 1,000, perhaps beyond? Yes, I do believe that. And I'm also I've started dropping little kernels of alchemy, which I am a part of that tradition, and I'd love to see that come back to naturopathic medicine as well, with Paracelsus as being one of the most celebrated historical alchemists and original naturopathic, forebears. Mm-hmm. So also in the alchemy tradition, there is the idea of immortality of the body as well. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I personally, I guess I would tend to be more skeptical, but the point is that a long life is still not an immortal life, and ultimately the theory ultimately subsumes all of these ideas, I think, successfully, meaning the various traditions can all be explained in terms of narratives that we create, or things that we do, practices that we do also that keep us, alive for longer, or what have you. Yes. But that we're still in the fundamental existential problem remains to be solved in one way or another, right? And so I'll expand a little bit.
In general, in our society, in general. And I agree with you. I agree with you because this is a very rare few who have managed to transcend what is very typical for the average human being is to die, or also to have some fear of death. Because there are some who still die, let's say in a normal lifespan, but who have no fear of death, who realize it's not the end by any means, right? And transcend that.
Or at least that they have a sense of cosmic significance. They have not lived in vain.
Sure.
In some way, right? There is a sense of transcending limitation, transcending the limitation of the physical realm, whether in reality or symbolically. And the point is that psychologically, symbolically is good enough.
Very nice.
That's a key.
Okay, so now bring this, and by the way, we will accept for the vast majority of people who are operating from what Becker has proposed. I wholeheartedly agree that the denial of death, which is based on the fear of death. So first you're afraid and you go, holy crap, I have no control over this. This is freaking me out. Then you bury that in the subconscious. And then comes the denial and different ways of compensating for that fear.
Well, and the point is that you can't just bury it by itself, because that means you would go crazy. The kind of merely burying it, right? It's impossible. It's culture and belief systems and so on are what bury those things. In other words, we need them in order to be able to do that successfully, right? So I'll explain a bit more the details of his idea, because at first they may seem just banal on the surface. Like he talks about how we have a need to live as heroes, right? That's the idea of cosmic significance,
right?
And we're all looking to create an immortality project, as he calls it, and that can be a personal one, like such as if somebody is an artist and through their art create something bigger than themselves, etc., or it can be a collective immortality project. And essentially, a culture is a collective immortality project or narrative. And more broadly, we can look at history as a succession of immortality narratives, and history as being like a theater for heroism, a theater in which, a stage on which various immortality narratives are being played out forever.
Yeah, with religion, like a cultural religious group, is very much that like I read in your paper that you wrote. Can I put that paper up actually on NDs for Truth as well? Would you feel comfortable with that?
I'll just look at it to maybe briefly edit it, but within a day we can put it up.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because I didn't share that among the things I shared.
No problem.
Yeah, so we can talk about different religions as solving the problem of immortality in different ways, right? We can look, let's say the Western religions, Judaism is like a sophisticated tribal perspective where the individual is not immortal, but the nation or the tribe or the nation becomes immortal through a special connection with God, and there is the immortal land of Israel, etc. And Christianity can be viewed as gaining immortality through letting go of bodily strictures and believing in the transformative alchemy, so to speak, of Christ. And
pause right there for a sec.
Yeah.
Again, I just want to interject this idea that you almost using your intention is to imply that this is being done successfully. And I would agree if by successfully you mean successfully denying, right? Successful, like having some sort of plan in order to be able to continue without this confrontation of fear.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm suggesting is that I think a culture would be more healthy if it embraced death and faced death in a more direct fashion and not through this like kind of heroic fantasy world of immortality structures.
Right. So I think, there's no contradiction between what you're saying and what I'm saying. So I guess the idea is that most immortality structures, right, or projects or narratives, they're imperfect, right? You give up a certain degree of personal responsibility to become part of a group, or
right,
or even if it's a more individual kind of immortality in Christianity, you are forgiven of your sins, whether you did something bad or not, right? In Islam, you kind of give up everything for God's, awesome power and so forth, right? I think perhaps Buddhism comes a bit closer to what you're saying, right? And obviously, those you have those leanings. The idea that all of reality ultimately has to be viewed with circumspection, and that we have to let go ultimately of everything, and like you say, confront death. And the idea, I think it's a Taoist, if not Buddhist, idea of enlightenment as falling to your death with your eyes open.
Also, Shintoism is very embracing death. Mm-hmm. But I would say that in each of these cultures, so let's say we accept the vast majority, or perhaps some majority of people would, in Christianity, follow it in that way, and Judaism follow it in that way. But for an individual, there is always the potential to realize within each of those paths, mm-hmm. a direct confrontation with death. So when Christ says those who lay down their lives will pick them up again, and those that hold on to their lives will lose them. He's teaching this.
Right,
He's
right.
showing that by embracing death, you pick up your life. You live to the fullest. You smell the roses. You're more alive than ever than when you live afraid of dying. You don't live at all.
Yes, right. And I think within each culture there is the solution for the masses.
Yes.
And ideally also, unfortunately, the solution for the masses is often constrictive and doesn't present them with the higher possibilities. But certainly within each of those religions, you have like various martyrs, you have sages, you have saints, you have the Sufi tradition in Islam, right? That all of those more mystical and self-sacrificing traditions, are ultimately they're a subset of each religion, but they all come together to proclaim one truth, right? One pan-religious truth. And this is the idea of so Kierkegaard, right? Becker talks about, he starts with Kierkegaard, the existentialist tradition, and combines with Freud, right? He works from these two roots. And in Kierkegaard, you have this idea of the knight of faith, which is that person which on an individual level is able to transcend the fear of death, precisely as you say, on an individual level, being able to face all of reality with all of its contradiction, with all of its tragedies, with all of its beauty, and ultimately just kind of rise above it all. And it doesn't matter at that point if the person is actually immortal or not immortal. It's fine to die the next day. All is good, right? And that's a rare achievement in any culture, but certainly one that I think is the right one to strive toward for anybody in any culture.
I agree. Instead of perhaps this idea of edifying the need to establish one's immortality in, I know, egoic or, even artistic, literary, anything, just some way of like such a fear of death of this self that I need to establish my immortality. So I'll have 100 children, I just want that will establish my lineage and just things like that. Instead of doing that, what you said with Kierkegaard's Night of Faith. I love that Becker is also offering this higher path, this higher.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. He's trying to distill that higher path out of the morass of humanity.
Yes.
And there are obviously other ones in different traditions that have done it. Right. There's a wonderfully titled book called The Courage to Be. From the 1950s, I believe, by a German theologian. So in that case, a Protestant tradition, right? Paul Tillich, Tillich. And this idea of, he talks about the foundation of virtue as being not truth or beauty but courage, right? The idea of courage to be meaning to face reality and its entropic quality, the fact that things ultimately may all decay and rise above that, be okay with that.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's a similar idea. And and ultimately this idea of enlightenment, right? In the different manifestations, in the Eastern manifestation of letting go of all illusion.
Yes.
In the Western manifestation of rising above your cultural influence, the comforts of your culture, to just be able to face death with your eyes open.
Right. And I could see the significance of this. And I think this is why it's so relevant for you. And I could see the relevance in it for the whole pandemic narrative, right? Like, you want to tie that in now? You want to bring that into this, what you're talking about, the denial of death, the immortality and all this stuff? Yeah.
So I guess the way I see people from this perspective is that people live in nested hierarchies of various immortality narratives that buttress them literally and buffer them from facing that fear of death in that symbolic sense that Becker talks about. And so, if you are American, you can be proud of your nation and the American dream, and that's perhaps a subset of the whole notion of this Enlightenment project of constant progress and technological, redemption through technology and so forth. And that can be a subset of the idea of dominion over nature, which goes back to the early Bible. And people aren't aware they're not aware the extent of which these various structures actually exist for them, right? They're invisible to people usually. Yes. So when people were faced with the pandemic, I think anybody for whom the idea of technological progress is part of their inner framework, part of their immortality framework, those people, they had to be sucked in to that perspective. And it doesn't matter how intelligent they are. And, and similarly, you can talk about various other possible avenues in which, by which they believe that perhaps the authorities are benevolent, right? That's part of their framework. If they were ever to contemplate the possibility that the government doesn't want what's good for you, then they would fall apart. That would be a breakage in their immortality system,
and also in their political system, which does have to assume that the government is benevolent and wants the best for the people. That's why you would give it more power.
Right, exactly, yeah. And it's honestly tough to live without that, unless you are the Knight of Faith and you're above that. Admitting those realities creates anxiety And I am one of those people. I'm not a knight of faith. I'm a person who is perhaps more open to being anxious about things for the sake of seeing the truth. But that's a sacrifice, right? Because somewhere I believe that sacrifice will lead me to the right place. But not all people have that framework. Some people are completely enmeshed with the idea of needing to feel safe, safe in numbers, or safe, by virtue of what the authorities provide and so forth. And so I have some friends who are like that, right? I can talk to them day and night about the evidence and about the obvious. I mean, that's the thing. The narrative has collapsed so spectacularly that, and yet they still will persist. They will still listen
like
to
that KGB. I don't remember the name of it, but there's this sort of circulating words of a KGB, ex-KGB, a Russian who says that once a person has been demoralized, because he was part of this whole regime,
right,
in Leninist, Stalinist Russia. Once they've been demoralized, it's like impossible to get them out of that. Yeah,
but I would argue for personal responsibility. I think they become demoralized because they have enough of a belief in the system, whereas people who don't become demoralized. They become the dissidents.
Right, that's right. The ones that are not conforming, the ones that are not so invested in the immortality complex structures.
Or in those particular ones, right? They have their own. They can stand their own ground.
Yes, that's right.
And again, I mean, obviously the highest rung of that is to rise above all of that. But I'm talking about the everyday dissidents, right? They still have their immortality narratives, but they're independent of the immortality narrative provided by the
government, by media, by science, by medicine. Right. And I would add that, if a person is to admit that, for instance, the government is not benevolent, for instance, and the mainstream media is not reporting the facts, in addition to anxiety, it can cause a number of psychological and emotional reactions. Just total disillusionment, total, loss of center, total, which is all for the best. Anything that leads to your in the direction of cure, if I will use the homeopathic term, which is truth, liberation, that is positive, even if it's initially painful. So as homeopaths, we accept that to bring health, sometimes there is a worsening of an immediate worsening, which is just an interpretation of discomfort, because it's not really worsening if it's getting better. Ultimately, it's just uncomfortable. And that is good. We should celebrate that kind of discomfort.
Yeah. And we, obviously, you and I agree on that, but not everybody agrees on that, even though I would say that's objective truth, what we're describing here.
Yes.
Nevertheless, for many people, that's not part of their worldview. And for them, that would be a horrifying thing. And, people would still need to go to work the next day, and they're constrained within a whole bunch of constraints. And life might be for them extremely uncomfortable were they to admit certain things.
Yeah, they might have like a kind of a nervous breakdown. They could possibly die from shock. I doubt it, but I think they would go into an existential crisis.
Yeah.
But there's enough of, I want to say, the true narrative, the alternative narrative, the healthy narrative that could gather them in. There's enough people saying this out loud. It's not like the truth has been completely suppressed. The alternative voices have been completely suppressed.
No, not at all. But the interesting thing is that despite the truth being available, right? That to me, the fact that many people have woken up is great, but that's an easy one to understand. That makes sense. I'm always still interested in the more difficult question of why the ones that have that access still persist, right? So, and that's, I think, the key, that they're not interested or willing to go through this phase of a healing crisis. It's not their worldview to heal. I suppose.
Right.
In the first place. I mean, that's
Right.
why homeopathy can apply to anybody, but in practice, only a relatively small minority is actually interested in this type of healing, which
And
was
we
a
have to,
painful thing for me to realize as an early homeopathy zealot, in the early days.
yes, right, absolutely. It's a painful thing to realize. And also the culture, and this is pretty widespread culture, although, and it has infiltrated all parts of the world, but it's largely Western, is to to be comfortable. It's almost a hedonistic mode of operation, is to live for that which is pleasurable and to avoid displeasures and painful things.
Yeah, and connecting it to the idea of immortality narratives, this is the narrative of triumphing over nature, which is, in my view, the worm at the core of the entire Western tradition, right? This idea that having dominion over the earth, or at least, I suppose, dominion, if we are responsible, is a good thing, but how it's played out in practice, right? Where by triumphing over nature, we experience ourselves as stronger than nature and therefore immortal, right? It still falls this theory, I like it, that it's very all-encompassing. You can really see how any human phenomenon that you look at can be fit without forcing it into this, right? So yeah, we're living in an age of lack of soulfulness, so we are literally pursuing the immortality of the body, right? On a collective level.
It's amazing. I do appreciate this model and reading having you on Endies for Truth and reading your words, which hopefully we'll share. It has been edifying of something I've known fundamentally about humanity. But when you get those things that click into place and there's a broader perspective, a more clear perspective that comes from it. This has definitely what's come from discussing with you and reading your views on Becker and stuff like that. It's amazing. And I can't help but notice, like when we say having dominion over the earth in the way that you're talking, I mean, this is really one of the premises of the Torah, in the book of Genesis, having dominion over the plants and the animals and everything. But I see a truth in that, but also that this can be taken grossly out of context, that we need to suppress how nature could harm us by making it immaculately innocuous and virus free, and just like living out of fear, so that all of our dominion over nature becomes a suppression, rather than embracing nature and loving it and understanding our role in the center of that. That's a different story,
Yeah, and the role in the center, in the sense that we are sentient beings, seemingly the only ones, who are highly sentient on this planet, at least in that self-reflective sense, and therefore we have the responsibility to have dominion, right? Only in the sense of not screwing things up,
Right, absolutely right, and to be good stewards of the land, good stewards of the plants and of the animals, of finding harmony there, and applying beautiful naturopathic principles to help us with that, like. My gardening this year took on a new level when we were giving homeopathic remedies to plants that were suffering from bugs eating them, or from powdery mildew, and to see a remarkable response, and the so on and so forth with animals as well. Like applying our principles of naturopathic medicine to be good stewards of the land is good too. So do you feel like you have adequately addressed what you wanted to address in all of these, what we've kind of opened the door to discuss with Becker and, immortality narratives and the fear that has gripped people in their immortality narrative and the need to have dominion over nature and stuff? Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I guess to cap this aspect is that if we want to change people's minds, it's not sufficient to provide them with the truth as we see it, right? I mean, it's a starting point, and I think it's very important to speak up and right. For example, Matthias Desmet is the one who spoke about the idea of the mass formation, this his hypothesis about why people are sucked into believing in essentially false idols, which are also immortality symbols, right? Like the vaccine is a classic immortality symbol in the terms that we outlined.
Right. What was the name of that person?
No, Matthias, Mattis, I believe, and last name Desmet, Desmet.
Okay.
And he wrote a book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, I believe. It's not an original theory, but he made it, brought it to attention and tied it with the COVID response. So the idea there is people are aimless and separate, and you make them notice something, and they gather together around essentially this false idol, right? Like the golden calf, dancing around the golden calf, and being together apart. In other words, they're not really together; they're together facing this, and sublimating their fear of death through this immortality symbol, false immortality symbol, because it's not God, it's not the highest immortality symbol. So
amazing.
And so to change people's minds, you ultimately need to give them alternatives in terms of their immortality narratives. Like you have to somehow offer them another worldview before they are going to be willing to adopt the specific science that you're trying to present to them. Or
give me an example of an alternative immortality narrative, another worldview that would be helpful as an SN2 reaction in chemistry, when one bond changes to another bond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for example, I guess if you know probably of Charles Eisenstein, right? The idea of like interbeing. He writes various essays and has written a few books. So he's offering an alternative immortality narrative, which is fundamentally a Buddhist one, but in modern terms, right? In modern ecological terms, and interbeing as being the our true nature, right? When we do something little, when we take care of our little child, it is of cosmic significance because that child is connected to everything else. When we plant a tree, even if we can't save the Amazon, we're nevertheless doing something that's of cosmic significance because that tree and all trees and all of life and all of the cosmos beyond our planet are all interconnected, right? So that's an example of him offering to people an alternative view of reality. And if somebody happens to pop and jump, able to jump into this new worldview, and that's where the paradigm concept of Thomas Kuhn is really apt, to the idea that paradigms are kind of discontinuous. You kind of, it's like an illusion where you either see it one way or another way. You have to switch your paradigm rather discontinuously, and then boom, everything suddenly is viewed in other ways, right? In modern physics, mass means something different from Newtonian physics. So in the interbeing worldview, doing that little thing is of cosmic significance, as opposed to in the atomistic worldview, where this is you're just a tiny creature in a vast universe and therefore meaningless.
I would like to propose the possibility here that what Charles Eisenstein, for instance, as one example, is actually offering is a basic truth that exists as a collective reality, as a collective truth. So in a way, the model that I come from is that you either live in the truth or you live in illusion. And most of us live in illusion, and we could live partly in the truth and partly in illusion as well. Mm-hmm. And life is about dissolving illusion and claiming truth, which is, so it's an effortless thing. It's not something you have to, smash into your brain. It's something that catches you in its net because it is what is.
Right.
And so that would be a nice alternative as well. Just this idea. I mean, how you get somebody to do that is another story, but I'm just sort of interjecting the idea that it is fundamentally there to begin with.
Well, I think, I agree, but that's a very high level reality. We may need to bridge, the chasm between their reality and our reality. in
Yes.
different ways, right? In creative ways and individual ways.
Yeah. I
That's
like
where the
this
idea
too.
of individualization comes into play.
I like this too, also, David, because, for a while now, I've kind of taken a step back from even making any attempt to try to convince somebody or to get through to them, even not convince, but just to get through to them and say, hey, look, you're hurting yourself. Like, because I did that so much with so many people. And I saw this phenomenon of the total indoctrination, the demoralization, the totally buying the narrative. But I like the idea of what you're proposing to not give up on people. In other words, that there might be something that we can do. So keep going, keep establishing maybe some other examples, or if there are other examples you have of what we can do. What would be those bridges, paradigms that are not going from A to Z, but going maybe B, C, D, E, or F along those lines, kind of thing, right?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question, because I guess with my friends, I have not been successful on the whole.
Right.
I think I'm still stuck at the stage of breaking down their paradigm. And I think that's a rather egocentric perspective, right? So,
but I think you did a good job of it here. I think you chose one that is very all-encompassing and makes a lot of sense as to where people are coming from. And I would say that, I don't love the term, but the overlords or the globalists or the technocrats, they've studied the psychology of humanity. They are aware of that. So even though they don't let this get widespread, Becker's works, that's what they're operating from. They know that people are afraid of this. They know how to manipulate to get their outcome. So
yeah, and I mean, it's important to note, like, the Freudian tradition also led to modern propaganda theory, right? I believe his
right, that's right, exactly.
I forget his brother-in-law or somebody related to his wife, I believe, Edward Bernays, I believe he's the father of modern propaganda. So yeah, so the idea that understanding psychology can be used against people, I think, should be countered with understanding psychology as a way to open people's eyes. And that's why I suppose I'm sharing this book with the audience, because I've also shared this book with other people. And I think it has opened people's eyes, at least in the general sense of seeing that their worldview is not based on their rationality, right, on reason, but rather it's based on psychology.
Amazing. It's deep, it's profound, it's great. And I like the idea of, like, you can't, like what Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody.
Right.
And in a way, from your perspective of the immortality systems or concepts, whatever you call them, structures, that you can't serve two paradigms in that regard. You can't serve the one paradigm, which is totally fear-based. I think this is what you're saying, and another one which is liberating from that fear.
Yeah, and it's that jump between the two that requires suffering, right? Anxiety, suffering, etc., which is the chasm that people aren't interested in crossing.
And that's why I have, in a sense, taken a step back from attempting to get through to people, because you the whole, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him want to go through an aggravation.
Yeah.
You can lead a horse to water, or you could present the direction to the water. But if the horse is going to have to, like, get all sweaty and maybe get a few cramps along the way, and his model of reality is also to not inconvenience himself for any displeasure, then that's also a bit of a stacked deck. But I think that the overall, examination of it's helpful. I find it healing for those of us that are still confounded by this experience. It's healing for those of us who can get to understand better how people have been so,
duped.
Duped, manipulated, So this is great, and I appreciate you being on here. And if you do bring it to the next level, perhaps with some kind of use of homeopathy or your knowledge in psychology and philosophy, if you do get it to that next level where you can, it's worked on your friends, for instance, then let's have another ND.
I will let you know what the trick was.
Please, because that really is what we need more than anything. I do have some concern that there's going to be a great split in humanity. I don't know where it will split numbers wise, right? But there's a split happening. And so when we embrace people just embracing this false narrative, which is based on this agenda for control, and then those of us who are really self-actualizing. Mm-hmm. So go ahead. Did you want to say something? And I also want to offer you the opportunity to, anyway, I'll save that for a moment. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that split is the unfortunate reality. And I don't have a solution. I mean, I'll let you know if I do, but that is the reality, that there are different ways of looking at things, and basically systems battling for control. And I suppose we also want control in a sense by having people.
We're the benevolent rulers that want.
Right, exactly. And that's where you hear talks about global, this centralized tyranny versus decentralization, and people being allowed to create their own realities in a decentralized way. And I mean, I have no qualms with that. I suspect that that's the higher truth. I think it's also reflected, if I just jump briefly into homeopathy, the idea of the transition from the gold series in the periodic table theory of Jan Scholten to the lanthanides, right? Where the lanthanides are higher atomic weight than the gold series. The gold series has to do with centralized control, with rulership. Yes. The lanthanides have to do with autonomy, with decentralization, right?
Right.
And I think that perhaps that's the natural path that humanity needs to take to move on to the next level. My fear is, though, that that transition is going to be very painful for humanity. There are examples of such transitions in the past. Like you look at in the Bronze Age, roughly, I think 1100 BC, somewhere there was something that's called the Bronze Age collapse.
Yes.
Suddenly, several civilizations in the Mediterranean basin just collapsed, and villages were abandoned and so forth. And there was a dark age for about, let's say, 200 years or so. And out of those ruins, then later on, you had the emergence of city-states, such as Athens and Sparta and so forth, right? Decentralized little organizations that were actually smaller politically than the previous empires. They're, relatively large empires for that time.
Right.
But there was a collapse, and not much is known what happened, except that there was a heavy depopulation, right? People presumably died in large numbers, or were, had to leave to somewhere else. And obviously, that is the scary part of what's coming up for humanity. I'm not sure how to avoid that.
What's potential? And I'm not sure I know how to avoid that either, but always there remains the possibility that if this is really, if we really boil it down, you're talking about demonic forces. Like if it really boils down to good versus evil, let's say, truth versus illusion and control, liberty and health and love versus control and dominion, then there is always the possibility of the end chapter bringing something completely surprising and phenomenal. Like I have shared in other NDs for Truth this idea of the Looking Glass project Looking Glass, that was like a covert black operative project, was showing just one eventuality. No matter what they tried to manipulate or change, or no matter what they tried to do, there was always this inevitable event that was coming after. This is after the alignment of December 21st, 2012. No matter what they did, it was always coming to this eventuality, which could be a great awakening and great liberation of humanity. So there is always that point.
Yeah, I'm open to that for sure. Some sort of mass paradigm shift instigated by something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to add, with your homeopathic analogy of moving into the lanthanides, which I entirely agree, that going from I'm going to listen to everybody else, so I'm going to listen to myself. It's autonomy, right? In the lanthanides, that's the theme. also to include the actinides, because the actinides has to do with the wise old yoga master, Taoist master who says you have no control over your reality. Surrender control, recognize that death, whether you become immortal in this life or you die in this life, you have to confront death no matter what. You have to confront that point of taking the big dive into the abyss.
And that's represented by those radioactive elements that just
that's right,
all apart from the weight of their deep wisdom, let's say.
That's right. Well, it's deep wisdom of old age. It's also the theme of just recognizing that you can't run from death, but you can embrace death, and that we have no control. So the actinides go and they merge sort of with before the first stage, right? That before hydrogen, where it's just birth into any existence whatsoever. It's sort of like they're the same extremes, right? The extremes you reunite. So that's good. I'd like to see the actin, because to have an actinide perspective and a lanthanide, in fact, like the nuclear threat has been around already in humanity. So it is a part of humanity, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So that's cool. And in keeping with tradition on Endies for Truth, do you have any last words of wisdom? It could be tying in something that we talked about, or just a fresh out of your heart right now that you'd like to leave with.
Yeah, I guess it's something that we instantiated today as well. But the idea of whatever your station in life, whatever your identity is, whatever your ethnic identity, professional identity, paradigm, etc., like to strive always to go one step beyond your perspective, right? If you're a homeopath, don't just think like a homeopath, like stretch yourself beyond that. This idea of pluralism, right? In medicine, but also in life in general. If you are a fervent believer in a certain religion, stretch yourself beyond that. Consider the truth in other religions. If you are a doctor, open your eyes to naturopathic medicine. If you're a naturopath, see the goodness in conventional medicine, right? And instead of being oppositional, just see things from their perspective, that there are deep truths there as well. And as I said, in my own experience, that attending to physical issues, even though my home base is the spiritual realm, has proven helpful for me and for my patients as well. So I view things as a result of that less oppositionally and less ideologically. Like we want to have a neat picture of reality, but the truth is that reality is so complex that you have to have multifaceted perspectives. So I guess it's a general suggestion, and that to me, that's the idea of enlightenment in the not extreme sense of completely letting go of all illusion, is at the very least to let go of the illusion of the illusions that are introduced by your own limitations, your own cultural and other limitations.
Yeah, like us versus them, and this is like an extension of your consilience, right? In science as well. I appreciate that very much. That's a beautiful perspective.
Yeah, that talk that they give on which people can view the idea of how does homeopathy connect to the rest of the sciences, as opposed to just being this, unique thing that's floating in empty space and not really connected to anything else, and forever, as a result, marginalized and isolated.
Right. Very, very interesting. Wonderful perspective. And I hope it helps homeopathy. I hope it helps each individual. And I can see its value for myself in my own life. I could totally see how that is powerful and healing on many perspectives. So Dr. David Norman, thanks so much for being on Endies for Truth.
Thank you for hosting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've had a great time, and I hope that the viewers will as well. I certainly got a lot out of this, and I can imagine that others will as well. So, all right, everybody, have a great night. Peace be with you. Shalom Aleichem. Assalamu alaikum. And all that goodness. Peace be with you. Take care. Dr. Moshe, over and out.